The letter arrived on my 18th birthday. No cake, no candles, no one singing in the hallway of St. Agnes Indian School while I pretended to be surprised. Just Sister Constance's worn shoes clicking down the dormitory corridor at 6 in the morning, stopping at my bed, her hand pressing a brown envelope into mine before I had even opened my eyes. "Ren," she said quietly, "you need to read this." The envelope was thin, cheap paper, a postmark from Utah that I traced with my finger like it might tell me something the words inside could not. My name was written in handwriting I did not recognize, and below it in smaller letters that looked like they had been typed by someone who did not care whether the news arrived gently or not, it read Stone Creek, Ren Eloise, urgent, regarding the estate of Harlan Stone Creek, deceased. Deceased, I remember sitting up in that narrow bed. The springs creaked beneath me, while 30 other girls slept in rows on either side, their breathing shallow and synchronized the way captive things learn to breathe together. The window at the end of the room was just starting to show gray light. March in New Mexico, cold enough that my breath made small clouds as I tore the envelope open and read the words that would change the rest of my life. Your father died on January 14, 1941 in San Juan County, Utah. As his sole surviving heirs, you and your siblings are entitled to his estate consisting of 42 acres of canyon land. Assessed value $10. Please contact our office to arrange transfer of deed. $10. I read that number 3 times. Let it sit on my tongue like something bitter. $10 for 42 acres. $10 for a man who had walked out of our mother's house 3 months after she died, said he was going to find work in the canyon country, and never came back. The shuffle of bodies moving toward the washroom in the half-dark, each girl following the same path she had followed every morning since the day they brought her here. Some of them had been at St. Agnes since they were 5 years old. Some of them could not remember their mother's faces. Some of them had stopped trying. I watched them move past my bed, and I thought about what my life would look like if I stayed. 20 years from now. 30. Working in the kitchen, scrubbing floors growing old inside walls that had been built to contain me. The nuns would age and new nuns would come, and the building would get older, and the girls would keep arriving, taken from their families the same way we had been taken, and the machine would keep running because machines do not stop themselves. Someone has to stop them. I put the letter back in my pocket and stood up and made my bed the way Sister Constance had taught us, with hospital corners and a blanket pulled tight enough to bounce a coin off of, because discipline was the first thing they taught you and the last thing you forgot. And I carried the knowledge of my father's death through the morning routine, like a stone I had swallowed that sat heavy and cold at the bottom of me, weighing everything down. Lark found me an hour later in the washroom. I was still holding the letter. My hands were shaking so hard the paper rattled, like something alive, something trying to escape. "What is it?" she demanded. My sister was 15 and had the temperament of a thunderstorm that never quite passed. 3 years at St. Agnes had done nothing to gentle her. The nuns had tried beatings, isolation, extra prayers, kitchen duty until her hands cracked and bled from the lye soap. And Lark had responded to all of it with the same flat stare that said she was enduring this place, not accepting it. That one day she would leave, and when she did, she would burn it down behind her. She had arrived at St. Agnes 2 years after me, brought in the back of a government truck with 6 other children from families the Bureau of Indian Affairs had deemed unfit. Unfit meant poor. Unfit meant native. Unfit meant living in a way that the men in Washington did not understand and therefore could not permit. She had been 12 years old, and she had bitten the hand of the man who tried to cut her hair. They had held her down and cut it anyway, and she had not cried, and she had not spoken to anyone for 2 weeks afterward. And when she finally did speak, the first thing she said was that she would grow it back and no one would ever touch it again. She grew it back, and no one ever touched it again. "Ren, what happened?" I handed her the letter. She read it faster than I had, her dark eyes scanning the page the way a hawk scans open ground, looking for the thing that matters, the thing that moves. Her jaw tightened, her nostrils flared, and then she did something I had not expected. She laughed. $10, Lark said. The sound came out sharp and bright like a stone cracking. "That son of a—" She caught herself. The nuns had ears everywhere. Even the walls at St. Agnes had been trained to listen and report. $10. That is what we are worth to him. That is what 6 years of nothing adds up to. A canyon and $10. She folded the letter and handed it back. Her fingers were steady, but her voice was not. He's dead. Good. She said it fast. Too fast. And then her face crumpled for just a second, 1 second, before she rebuilt it into something hard and sharp and impenetrable, the way she had learned to rebuild herself every morning in this place. The way all of us had learned. Good, she said again. The nuns said it was stubbornness. The same stubbornness they saw in every native child who refused to bend, who refused to forget, who refused to become what the school demanded. They prescribed prayer and punishment in equal measure, as though famine and pain were the same medicine. But I knew it was neither shock nor stubbornness. Fen had simply decided that a world without our mother in it did not deserve his voice, and no amount of punishment or prayer or threat had convinced him otherwise. He had drawn a line and he stood behind it with a quietness that frightened people who did not understand what real strength looked like. He communicated through drawings, quick, precise sketches on any scrap of paper he could find, the back of hymn sheets, the margins of arithmetic worksheets, the smooth inner bark of cottonwood when he could get it. A bird meant he was hungry. A sun meant he was tired. A hand with 5 fingers spread wide meant he loved us. And sometimes late at night when the dormitory was dark and the nuns had finished their rounds, and the only sound was the wind against the windows, he would draw our mother's face from memory, over and over again, as though he were afraid of forgetting, as though each drawing was a spell that kept her alive in the only way he still could. The nuns had tried to stop the drawing too. They took his paper. They took his pencils. They told him that idle hands were the devil's workshop and that a boy his age should be learning a trade, not wasting time on pictures. But Fen found ways. He drew with charcoal on the back of his hand. He scratched images into the frost on the dormitory windows. He traced shapes in the dust of the courtyard with a stick and stood over them like a guard until the wind erased them. They could take everything else from him. They could not take the pictures out of his head. I found him in the chapel where he often hid during morning chores. The light through the stained glass painted him in patches of red and blue. He looked so small sitting in that enormous pew, his legs not even reaching the floor, his hands folded in his lap around a piece of paper he had already been working on. I did not know what was on that paper. Not yet. I sat down beside him, put my arm around his thin shoulders, felt him lean into me the way he always did, trusting and warm, the way a child leans into the only solid thing left in a world that has taken everything else. Fen, I said, I have to tell you something about Dad. He looked up at me. His eyes were our mother's eyes, dark and deep and filled with things he could not say, oceans of thought behind a surface so still you might mistake it for emptiness if you did not know where to look. And somehow, before I spoke a single word, I saw that he already knew. He pulled the folded paper from his lap, unfolded it carefully the way you unfold something precious, something fragile, something that matters more than the person holding it. And he showed me what he had drawn that morning before anyone had come to wake us, before Sister Constance had walked the corridor with the letter in her hand. It was our father's face, not angry the way I remembered him in those last months before he left when grief had turned him into someone we did not recognize. Not distant the way Lark remembered him, a man already halfway gone, even when he was standing in front of you. He had drawn our father smiling, young, the way he must have looked before sorrow hollowed him out and the canyon country called him away from everything he should have stayed for. Below the portrait in Fen's careful handwriting were 2 words, he's gone. I did not ask how he knew. Fen had always known things before the rest of us, the way some people know rain is coming before the first cloud appears. Our mother used to say he had the old sight, the kind that runs in certain families and skips generations, the kind that arrives uninvited and sees what it wants, the kind that the boarding schools tried to beat out of children because it frightened the people who did not understand it. Yes, I said, he's gone. Fen nodded slowly. Then he turned the paper over and began to draw again. This time it was something new. A canyon, red walls dropping into shadow, a crack in the earth so deep and narrow that the bottom was invisible. And at the base of those walls, barely visible, drawn with a line so faint I had to hold the paper close to see it, there was a small door. And behind that door light. The box arrived 3 days later. It was wooden about the size of a bread loaf, and it had been mailed from a post office in Mexican Hat, Utah, by someone named Hostine Nez. The postage was overpaid by 6 cents. Until the dormitory was dark and the nuns had finished their rounds, and the only sound was the breathing of girls who had been taken from their families and taught to forget who they were. Girls who spoke English in the daylight and whispered their true names in the dark, the names their mothers had given them, the names that meant something in languages this school was designed to destroy. Lark sat on the edge of my bed. Fen sat on the floor, his knees drawn up to his chest, his eyes fixed on the bundle in my lap. I unwrapped the deerskin. Inside were 47 letters. They were addressed to us. To Ren Lark and Fen Stone Creek, care of St. Agnes Indian School, Santa Fe, New Mexico. The envelopes were worn and soft-handled, many times sent with hope and returned without mercy. Every single one of them had been stamped in red ink across the front. Return to sender. Address unknown. My hands were shaking as I picked up the first one. The postmark read February 1936, 2 months after our father had left. The envelope had been opened probably by whatever clerk had processed the return, and inside was a single page of our father's handwriting. Tight, careful. The letters slanting slightly to the right the way a man writes when he is trying very hard not to let his hand shake. My dear children, I know you must be angry. I know you must think I have abandoned you. But I need you to understand something. I did not leave because I wanted to. The system would not let me take you. They said a half-breed man with no wife and no steady work could not raise 3 children alone. They said you would be better off at the school. Better off, as though a cage with a cross on the door is better than freedom with a father who loves you. I am fighting it. I have hired a lawyer with the last of the money your mother left. But these things take time, and the people who make the rules do not want men like me to win. Until then, I need you to be strong. I need you to remember who you are. I need you to hold on to the language your mother taught you, even if they try to take it away. Especially if they try to take it away. I am working in the canyon country now, looking for something I cannot explain yet. But when I find it, everything will change. I promise you I will come back for you. I will never stop trying to come back. Your father, Harlan. I read every letter that night, all 47 of them. Read them aloud in a whisper while Lark sat motionless beside me and Fen pressed his face into my shoulder. Not crying, just breathing the way you breathe when the ground you have been standing on turns out to be something else entirely. The letters spanned 6 years. They charted our father's desperate, relentless, futile campaign to reclaim us through a legal system designed from its foundations to keep Native children away from Native families. He had written to senators, to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, to the governor of New Mexico, to lawyers who took his money and did nothing, to church officials who wrote back with platitudes about God's plan and the civilizing mission of education. He had worked every job the canyon country offered: cowboy, miner, fence builder, trail guide, sending money to the lawyer, sending letters to us, sending both into a void that swallowed everything and returned nothing but silence and red ink stamps. And through it all, growing slowly in his letters like a vine climbing a wall, was his certainty that he had found something in that canyon, something extraordinary, something worth everything. The water is there, Ren. I can hear it when I press my ear to the eastern wall. I can feel it pulsing through the rock like a heartbeat. The ancient ones marked the place 1,000 years ago. They knew, and now I know. The school had never given us those letters. Not one. The last letter was different from the others. It was dated January 12, 1941. 2 days before Harlan Stone Creek died alone in a canyon the government did not think was worth the paper its deed was printed on. And it was not addressed to all of us. It was addressed to me, to Ren alone, my dearest Ren. If you are reading this, then Hostine has done what I asked, and I am no longer here to explain things myself. I am sorry. I am sorry for all of it. For leaving. For not being able to come back. For every birthday I missed and every nightmare I was not there to chase away. But I need you to know something. I found it. What I have been looking for all these years. There is water in that canyon, Ren. Not a seep, not a spring, a river. A real river running underground hidden behind the stone. I can hear it when I put my ear to the eastern wall. I can feel it pulsing through the rock like a heartbeat. The water is behind the handprints. The ancient ones marked the place 1,000 years ago. They knew, and now I know. I could not open the wall myself. I am too old, too tired, too sick from the winters out here. But you can, you and Lark and Fen, together. Go to the canyon, find the handprints, listen for the water. And when you open that wall, when the river finally flows again after 10,000 years of silence, I want you to know that I was there, that I never stopped trying, that I loved you with everything I had, even when I could not prove it. The canyon is your inheritance, Ren, not because it is worth money, because it is worth everything else. Your father, Harlan. I made the decision that night, in the dark with my sister's tears still wet on my shoulder, and my brother's silence wrapped around us like a blanket. I chose. We could stay at St. Agnes. I was 18 now, old enough to be discharged from the school's care, but I could petition to stay on as kitchen staff. They would feed me house, pay me pennies for labor that would break my back before I turned 30. Lark and Fen would remain students until they aged out too, learning to despise the Navajo half of themselves, while the white half was held up as something to aspire to. Or we could go to Utah. We could find the canyon that had swallowed our father. We could look for the water he had spent 6 years searching for. We could take the inheritance that the government had valued at $10 and see if it might be worth something more. It is crazy, Lark said when I told her. We do not know anything about farming. We do not know anything about surviving in the desert. We do not know, I said, but what is here, what is waiting for us if we stay? She was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked at Fen, who had begun drawing again. The same canyon, the same door at the bottom. But this time there was light spilling out from behind it. Bright, warm, golden light that seemed to push back the darkness of the stone. He wants to go, Lark said. He wants to go home, I corrected her. And so do I. Hostine Nez arrived at St. Agnes on the first day of April, 1941. He drove a truck so old and dented that the body rattled like a tin can full of stones, and the exhaust left a blue cloud hanging in the cool morning air long after the engine had been shut off. He was 58 years old, gray in his braids, hands like leather stretched over iron, scarred and darkened from decades of working a forge. He had been a blacksmith, he told me later, a farrier for the ranchers, a maker of tools for the Navajo families who still worked the land the old way, the way the government kept trying to make them stop. And he had been my father's closest friend. Harlan talked about you three every day, Hustine said as he loaded our small bags into the truck bed. Everything we owned fit into 2 canvas sacks. 6 years at the boarding school had taught us to travel light because anything you loved could be taken at any time, and the less you carried, the less they could use against you. Every single day, he kept your pictures in his shirt pocket, right over his heart. Said that way you were always close. Lark climbed into the truck first, taking the window seat without asking, the way she always took things, not by permission, but by right. Fen squeezed into the middle, small enough to fit anywhere, his sketchbook pressed against his chest. I hesitated at the passenger door and looked back at the school that had been my prison for 6 years. The building was red brick and white paint and iron bars on the lower windows. It had been built to look like a place of learning, and it had been operated as a place of erasure. Every child who walked through those doors walked in speaking a language and walked out ashamed of it, walked in knowing who they were, and walked out wondering if who they were was something that needed to be fixed. The building would keep standing after I left. The machine would keep running, but I would not be inside it anymore. Sister Constance was standing on the front steps watching. She did not wave, did not call out a blessing or a warning. But as I climbed into the truck, she raised one hand just slightly, just enough for me to see, and touched it to her heart. It was the closest thing to kindness St. Agnes had ever offered me, and I did not know what to do with it. So I closed the door. Ready? Hostine asked. Ready. We drove north through New Mexico as the sun rose through painted desert and red rock, and a landscape so vast it made the mountains look small and the sky look infinite, as though the world went on forever, and we were the only people left in it. Fen pressed his face to the window and watched the land scroll past. And for the first time in years, I saw something like wonder in his eyes, something alive. Lark fell asleep against my shoulder somewhere past Gallup. In sleep, she looked younger, softer, like the girl she might have been if our mother had not died and our father had not disappeared, and the school had not tried to scrape the DNA out of her with switches and silence and shame. How did he die? I asked Hostine, quietly, not wanting to wake her. The letter did not say. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. The knuckles went pale. Winter, he said. He was out in the canyon too long, trying to chip through the wall himself, even though I told him to wait. Even though I told him his body could not take another season out there. By the time I found him, the cold had already taken him. He was sitting against the eastern wall with his hands on the stone, like he was still listening for the water. Was he alone? He was always alone out there. That canyon. Hostine shook his head. People said it was cursed. Said nothing grew there, nothing lived there, nothing good could ever come from it. But Harlan saw something different. He said the canyon was waiting. Waiting for what? Hostine looked at me, then his dark eyes searching my face for something I did not yet know I carried. For you, he said. He said the canyon was waiting for his children. For the three of you to come and finish what he started. We stopped for supplies at a trading post 50 miles south of the canyon, a low stone building with a tin roof and a porch where three men sat in wooden chairs watching the road the way people watch roads, in country where nothing happens for days and then everything happens at once. Hostine went inside to buy salt and flour and matches. I followed him with a list of things we needed: seeds and tools and rope, things I had never bought before, because it's Saint. Agnes, you did not buy things. Things were given to you or taken from you, and the transaction was never in your favor. The man behind the counter looked at my list, looked at me, looked at Hostine. Canyon seeds, he said. You are the Stone Creek girl. It was not a question. Word traveled fast out here, carried on the same wind that carried dust and rumor, and the slow erosion of privacy that comes with living in a place where everyone knows everyone else's business. I am. He leaned forward on the counter. He was a large man, red-faced with the permanent squint of someone who had spent too many years looking at a horizon that never got closer. Your daddy's canyon, the one up north, 42 acres of nothing. That is the one. He looked at the men on the porch. One of them had come to the doorway listening. The man behind the counter smiled, not unkindly, but not kindly either, the way you smile at someone who has just told you they plan to fly by jumping off a roof. Sweetheart, he said, I knew your father. He was a good man. But that canyon will not grow a weed. There is no water within 20 miles. The soil is dust. The government assessed that land at $10, and they were being generous. He turned to the men at the door. You hear that Harlan Stone Creek's girls are going to farm the canyon. And they laughed. Not all of them. Not cruelly exactly. But they laughed the way people laugh at something so far beyond the boundaries of reason that mockery is the only honest response. One man slapped his knee. Another shook his head, slowly grinning the way you grin at a child who has just announced she is going to catch the moon. That land would not feed a lizard, one of them said. Your daddy spent 15 years out there, and all he got for it was a cold grave and a deed worth less than the gas it took to file it. Lark was standing behind me. I felt her tense, felt the heat coming off her, the way heat comes off a stove, felt her getting ready to say something that would turn this trading post into a battlefield. I put my hand on her arm. How much for the seeds? I asked the man behind the counter. He told me. I paid. I picked up our supplies. And I walked out of that trading post without looking back at the men who were still chuckling on the porch, still shaking their heads, still certain that three half Navajo girls with 2 canvas bags and a $10 canyon were the funniest thing that had happened in San Juan County all year. Lark caught up to me at the truck. Her face was dark. You should have let me say something. Why? So they could laugh harder. So they would know we are not a joke. I put the supplies in the truck bed and turned to face my sister. She was 15 years old and she was made of fire, and I loved her more than I had ever been able to say. They will know, I said. When the corn is growing and the water is running, and they come asking us how we did it, they will know. And that will be better than anything you could have said in there. Lark stared at me for a long moment. Then she climbed into the truck and slammed the door so hard the rearview mirror rattled. Fen, who had stayed in the truck through all of it, held up his sketchbook. He had drawn the men on the porch, their mouths open, their heads thrown back, and below them small but unmistakable 3 figures walking away. Not running, not fighting, walking, toward a canyon that none of the laughing men could see. We reached the rim at sunset on the second day. The truck could go no farther. The road had become a track, then a trail, then nothing at all. Just sage and pinon and red earth stretching toward a horizon that seemed to go on forever, as though the planet had decided this was the edge of things and everything beyond was theory. Hosteen stopped the engine and pointed through the windshield at a thin dark line in the distance. There, he said. That is it. That is your father's canyon. It did not look like much from where we stood. Just a crack in the earth like someone had taken an axe to the desert floor and walked away. But as we got closer, as we walked the last quarter mile through the sagebrush in the dying light, I began to understand why the man at the trading post had laughed, why the government had assessed it at $10, why everyone who had ever seen this place had written it off as worthless. There was nothing here. No water, no grass, no trees except a few twisted junipers clinging to the rim with the stubbornness of things that refused to die even when dying would be easier. Just red rock dropping away into shadow. 200 feet of sheer sandstone wall carved by a river that had disappeared before the pyramids were built. The canyon was narrow. So narrow that I could have thrown a stone from one side to the other without trying hard. And at the bottom, invisible from where we stood, there was only darkness. The kind of darkness that does not just mean the absence of light, but the presence of something patient, something that has been waiting a very long time. The wind came up from inside the canyon. It was cooler than the desert air, carrying a smell I did not recognize, something mineral, something old, something that reminded me of the root cellars our mother had kept when we were children, the cool, dark places where she stored potatoes and turnips and the dried herbs she used for medicine. The canyon breathed out, and the breath was ancient, and I stood at its edge and felt it on my face and knew that whatever was down there was not nothing. It is not much to look at, Hosteen admitted. I told your father that 100 times, but he just smiled and said that is because people do not know where to look. He handed me a leather pouch I had not noticed before, worn soft by years of handling, darkened by sweat and oil from hands that would never touch it again. He wanted you to have this. Inside the pouch was a folded piece of deerskin. I spread it out carefully on the ground, and in the fading light I saw my father's handwriting, precise and patient, mapping every ledge and crack and handhold on the canyon walls, marking the places where the rock was strong enough to hold weight and the places where it would crumble, drawing a path from the rim to the floor and beyond into passages I could not yet imagine. And at the bottom of the map, circled 3 times in red ink, was a symbol I did not recognize, a shape that looked almost like a door. What is this? I asked. Hosteen looked at it for a long moment. His face in the sunset light was the color of the canyon walls. Your father said it was the DNA word for door. He said when you find it, you will understand. Lark stepped to the edge of the rim and peered down into the darkness. The last light of the day painted her face in shades of gold and red, and for a moment she looked ancient like the women who had stood on this same rim 1,000 years ago, looking down into the same dark, deciding whether to descend. How do we get down? She asked. There is a route on the north end, ledges and handholds. Your father mapped it years ago. I looked down into the canyon. The shadow had swallowed the floor completely now. There was nothing to see, nothing to prove that what my father had written was true, nothing but darkness and the faint sound of wind moving through a space that had been empty for longer than anyone could remember. But Fen had moved to the edge beside me, and he was holding up his sketchbook, the drawing he had made that morning in the chapel at St. Agnes, before he knew about the letter, before he knew about any of this. The canyon with the door at the bottom, the light spilling out from behind it. He had drawn this place. He had drawn it before he had ever seen it. And standing on that rim with the last light dying and the first stars appearing in the narrow strip of sky above the canyon, I felt something I had not felt in 6 years. Not hope exactly. Hope was too fragile a word for what moved through me in that moment. It was something harder. Something built from the same stone as the canyon walls. The certainty that whatever was down there in the dark, whatever my father had spent 15 years listening, for whatever the ancient ones had marked with their handprints 1,000 years ago, it was real, and it was waiting for us. I folded the deerskin map and put it inside my shirt against my heart, the way my father had carried our photographs. And I turned to my sister and my brother and the old blacksmith who had driven 2 days to bring us here because a dead man had asked him to. We go down at dawn, I said, And the canyon held the words the way it held everything, gently, completely, without letting go. We descended at dawn. Lark went first. She was always the climber, the one who had scaled the walls of St. Agnes in the dark, when she could not bear to be inside anymore, the one who moved through vertical space the way other people moved through rooms instinctively without fear. As though gravity were a suggestion she had decided not to follow. She lowered herself over the rim and found the first handhold before I could tell her to be careful. I would not have told her to be careful. Lark did not respond well to caution. She responded to edges. Fen went second. He watched where Lark's hands went and placed his own in exactly the same spots, his small fingers fitting into cracks that seemed impossible, finding grip where the stone offered almost nothing. He climbed the way he drew with a precision that came from somewhere deeper than practice, from the place where his silence lived. I went last. The deerskin map was tucked into my shirt, pressed against my ribs, and I felt my heart hammering against it with every step down. Each beat pushing blood through my body, and the map pushing back my father's last instructions held against my chest like a second pulse. The canyon wall was 200 feet of red sandstone layered like the pages of a book left open in the rain. Each layer was a different shade. Rust and orange and cream and pale pink, each one laid down over millions of years, compressed into stone by the weight of everything that had come before. Time made visible. Time you could touch with your fingers and feel crumbling against your skin. The holds were where my father's map said they would be. Ledges just wide enough for a boot. Cracks just deep enough for fingers that knew what they were looking for. Harlan Stone Creek had climbed this wall hundreds of times in the 15 years he had lived in this canyon. He had worn the stone smooth in places, left scratches in others, marked the route with his body the way an animal marks a trail simply by walking it enough times. I could feel him on that wall. Not his ghost, not his spirit, nothing so dramatic. Just the wear patterns, the places where his boots had kicked away loose gravel, the places where his fingers had gripped the same cracks so many times that the stone was polished smooth while the stone around it was still rough. He had climbed this route in the dark and in the rain and in the bitter cold of Utah winters, and he had done it alone every time, and he had done it because we were at the other end of the effort, even though we did not know it. Halfway down, my foot slipped on a patch of loose gravel. For one long, terrible moment, I hung by my fingertips, my legs swinging over nothing, the canyon floor impossibly far below, and the stone under my hands was cold and indifferent and did not care whether I held on or let go. The desert does not care. That is the first thing it teaches you. Lark's voice floated up from below. Ren, you okay? Fine, I lied, and I found the next hold and kept going down. The air changed as we descended. It grew cooler, quieter, as though the canyon walls were absorbing every sound and storing it deep in the stone, collecting the noise of the world above and burying it the way the earth buries everything that falls into it. The sunlight reached the floor for only a few hours each day. My father's letters had told me that. And even now in the early morning, the bottom was still wrapped in blue shadow, a coolness that felt less like shade and more like the inside of something. The inside of a mouth. The inside of a hand held closed around a secret. When my feet finally touched solid ground, I stood still for a long moment, just breathing, feeling the weight of 200 feet of stone above me and the weight of what we had come here to do pressing down from the other direction. The canyon floor was 30 feet wide at its broadest point and 10 feet at its narrowest. The walls rose on either side like hands cupped around something precious, smooth and red and ancient beyond imagining. A dry riverbed ran down the center, filled with sand and polished stones that had been shaped by water 10,000 years ago, their surfaces round and gleaming, each one a small monument to a river that no longer existed. There was no water now, nothing but dust and silence and the faint mineral smell of stone that has been baking in dry air since before the first humans walked this continent. I knelt and picked up one of the river stones. It was smooth as glass, shaped by centuries of current into something perfectly round, perfectly balanced, as though the water that had made it had been trying to create something beautiful before it disappeared. I put it in my pocket. It was the first thing the canyon gave me. It would not be the last. This is it, Lark said. She was standing at the narrowest part of the canyon where the walls came so close together she could have touched both sides at once. Her voice was flat, not disappointed exactly, but close to it, the way a voice sounds when it is trying very hard not to admit that the thing it had been hoping for looks nothing like the hope. This is what he spent 15 years looking for. I did not answer her. I was looking at the map. At the symbol my father had circled in red, the one Hostine said meant door. According to his careful measurements and annotations, it was somewhere along the eastern wall past the narrows near a place he had marked with a small drawing of a hand. This way, I said. We walked single file through the narrows. The walls pressed close enough that I had to turn sideways, in places my shoulders scraping against stone that had been polished smooth by the ancient riverstone, so close on both sides that I could feel the coolness radiating from it, as though the rock itself were breathing out slowly after holding its breath for millennia. Fen moved through it easily, slipping past us like water, finding its own path, small enough to pass through spaces that made Lark and me turn and twist and push forward by stubbornness alone. Lark muttered under her breath. Words the nuns at St. Agnes would have punished her for. Words that made the narrow passage feel less like a tomb and more like something a person could survive. And then the narrows opened up, and I saw them. Handprints. Dozens of them. Hundreds maybe. Painted on the eastern wall in red and white and yellow ochre layered over each other in patterns that might have been art, or might have been language, or might have been both. Some were small as a child's palm. Others were large as a grown man's spread hand. They covered a section of the wall 20 feet wide and 15 feet high, climbing up toward a sky they could never reach, a constellation of human touch preserved in pigment and stone for longer than any nation on earth had existed. I had seen photographs of ancestral Pueblo rock art in the books at St. Agnes's library, the ones the nuns did not want us reading, because they were about the people who had lived here before the people whose existence complicated the story. The school was trying to tell us about civilization and progress and the necessity of forgetting. But seeing it in photographs was nothing like standing in front of it and breathing the same air and touching stone that had been touched by human hands 1,000 years before I was born. They are beautiful, Lark whispered. They were, but that was not why my father had marked them on his map. I stepped closer to the wall, close enough that the handprints were at eye level, their edges faded but still visible, still speaking across a silence that had lasted centuries. I raised my own hand and pressed it flat against the stone. The rock was cool beneath my palm, smooth, and alive in a way I could not explain. Not warm, not moving, not anything you could point to and say that is what makes it different from any other piece of stone in this canyon. But different, present, as though something on the other side were pressing back. And then I felt it, a pulse, faint at first, like a heartbeat heard from very far away through walls and distance and years of silence, but steady, rhythmic, coming from somewhere deep inside the stone, from a place the sunlight had never reached and the wind had never touched. I pressed my ear to the wall, closed my eyes, and I heard water. Not a drip, not a seep, not the slow accumulation of moisture that you might find in any desert crack if you waited long enough and were desperate enough to call it water. This was a flow, a current, a river running somewhere behind the sandstone, hidden from the world, invisible to anyone who had not been told to listen. Wren. Lark was watching me, her eyes narrowed. What are you doing? Listen, I said. She pressed her ear to the wall next to mine. For a long moment she was still. I could see the skepticism on her face, the readiness to pull back and say there was nothing there, that our father had been a dreaming man chasing something that did not exist. And then her eyes went wide. That is not possible, she breathed. But it was. It was exactly what Harlan had written about in that last letter. A river underground, running through fractures in the sandstone aquifer, fed by snowmelt from mountains 60 miles away, filtered through rock for 2 years before it arrived here. Invisible, impossible, and as real as the stone beneath our hands. Fen had already figured it out. He was on his knees at the base of the wall, his hands moving through the sand and gravel clearing, searching, digging with a focus that made his silence seem less like absence and more like concentration. And when he looked up at me, there was something in his face I had not seen since before our mother died. Hope. Actual hope. The kind that does not ask for permission and does not care whether you are ready for it. He had found a crack in the sandstone, a fracture about 2 feet wide and 4 feet tall, half hidden behind a fallen slab of rock and choked with sand that had blown in over centuries, layer upon layer, the desert slowly filling a doorway that no one had opened since the ancient ones had walked away from this place and left nothing but their handprints on the wall. According to my father's map, this was the symbol he had circled 3 times in red ink. This was the door. We spent the rest of that first day digging sand out of the crack with our bare hands. By evening, our fingers were raw and bleeding from the rough stone, and we had cleared 3 feet of packed sediment, and the crack went deeper still. We ate dried corn and salt pork that Hostine had packed for us, and we slept on the canyon floor with nothing but our coats and a single blanket between us and the cold stone. The stars above us were a narrow river of light framed by 200 feet of canyon wall on either side, and they were brighter than any stars I had ever seen because there was nothing between us and them. No roof, no ceiling, no institution, just sky. Hustine Nez came back 2 weeks later with supplies loaded in the bed of his battered truck. Food, a pickaxe, rope, seeds in small cloth sacks, varieties that could grow in desert conditions, varieties that Diné farmers had been planting for 1,000 years. And he brought a young man. Neil Sosi was 19 years old, quiet in a way that reminded me of Fen, though the resemblance ended at the silence. Where Fen's quietness came from, grief from a deliberate withdrawal from a world that had taken too much of Niol's, came from something else, from patience. From the kind of stillness you see in people who have learned to watch before they act and listen before they speak and measure the weight of a situation before they step into it. He had strong hands and shoulders built from years of working at his uncle's forge. He did not say much when Hostine introduced him, just nodded at each of us in turn, his dark eyes taking in the canyon walls and the narrow entrance to the cavern and the rough camp we had made on the canyon floor, a fire ring, a canvas lean-to, our 2 sacks of belongings, the tools Hostine had brought on his first trip. Everything we owned in the world. "Your father was a good man," Neil said finally. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that does not need volume to be heard. "He helped my family when the government tried to take our sheep, said it was wrong, said he would not stand by and watch it happen. He wrote letters. He filed complaints. He drove 200 miles to testify at a hearing for people who were not his blood and not his tribe because he believed that decency was not something you rationed." He paused, looked at the canyon, at the crack in the wall that Fen had found, at the darkness beyond it. "Now I help his children." That was all. But when he picked up the pickaxe and followed me through the narrow entrance into the cavern, when he stepped into that vast underground chamber and saw the river running through the darkness for the first time, clear and cold, and impossible, I watched his face change. I watched the stillness break just for a moment into something raw. Awe maybe, or recognition. The look of a man who has just been shown something he did not know he had been looking for. The cavern was 100 feet long and 50 feet wide and 30 feet high at its peak. An enormous vaulted chamber of red and cream sandstone, smooth as pottery, streaked with mineral deposits in colors I had no names for. Blues and greens and violets that had been painted on the stone by water and chemistry and time. And through the center of it, emerging from a crack in the eastern wall and flowing across the cavern floor into a channel that disappeared into the rock at the western end, was the river. 8 feet wide, a foot deep, clear as glass with a blue-green tint that came from minerals dissolved in it over thousands of years. And cold. Not mountain cold, but desert cold. The deep, constant chill of water that had traveled through stone for 60 miles, filtered and purified by the rock itself. 6 feet of rock, Neil said, measuring the western wall with his eyes, between the river and the canyon floor. 6 feet, I confirmed. He nodded slowly, calculating, weighing. Then he lifted the pickaxe. "Then we better start chipping." 6 weeks. That was how long it took. 42 days of dust and darkness, and the maddening knowledge that the river was right there, inches away, on the other side of a wall that got thinner with every swing, but never seemed thin enough. We worked in shifts. Lark worked like a woman at war, 5 hours a day, sometimes 6, her arms swinging the pickaxe until the muscles in her shoulders burned and her hands cracked and bled, and the blisters that formed on her palms broke open and formed again, and broke open again, until the skin beneath them hardened into something that was no longer quite skin. She did not complain, did not slow down, just attacked the stone with a fury that I understood better than she probably knew. Because Lark was not just fighting the rock. She was fighting every nun who had struck her at St. Agnes. Every time they had washed her mouth out with lye soap for speaking Diné. Every time they had cut her hair as punishment and made her stand in the corridor holding the severed braid while the other girls walked past. She was fighting the letter that said $10. She was fighting the clerk who had stamped return to sender on 47 envelopes. She was fighting 6 years of being told she was less than she was, and the rock was the first thing that had ever let her hit back. I worked 3 hours a day with a chisel while I calculated and measured and planned. The water level in the cavern was 8 feet higher than the canyon floor outside. When we broke through, the pressure would be enormous. If we did not control it, the water would flood the canyon floor and wash away everything we had built. We needed a channel, a controlled flow, a way to take the force of 10,000 years of waiting and direct it into something useful. I drew diagrams in the dirt by candlelight, measured angles with a piece of string and a stone tied to the end for a plumb line, calculated flow rates based on the width of the river and the height differential, and what I remembered from a science textbook at St. Agnes, that the nuns had probably not intended me to read as carefully as I did. The irony was not lost on me. The school that had tried to erase who I was had also taught me the mathematics I needed to become who I was meant to be. Fenn worked on the canyon floor, preparing the beds where we would plant. He had discovered something I had not expected and could not have predicted. The soil at the bottom of the canyon was not the thin, dusty desert earth of the rim above. It was deep, rich, dark with organic matter that had been deposited by the ancient river over millennia and preserved by the canyon walls, protected from wind erosion, sealed away from the elements, like a gift that had been wrapped and stored and forgotten. Alluvial sediment, 10,000 years of it, waiting to grow something. And Niall worked alongside all of us, doing whatever needed doing, saying little but seeing everything, sharpening the pickaxe when the edge dulled, reinforcing the lean-to when the wind picked up, carrying water from the cavern river in clay jars for us to drink while we worked. He moved through our small camp with a competence that made everything feel steadier, more possible the way a good foundation makes a house feel solid even before the walls go up. I noticed things about him, small things that I told myself did not matter, and that mattered more each day. The way he handed me tools, holding them by the blade so I could grip the handle without reaching. The way his voice changed when he said my name, dropping half a register, softening at the edges, as though my name were something he was being careful not to break. The way he looked at me when he thought I was not watching. Long, steady looks that were not staring and were not shy and were something I did not have a word for yet. And the nights on the canyon rim, when the work was done and the stars came out so thick and bright in that desert sky that they looked like spilled flour on a dark table. We would sit at the edge, our legs hanging over 200 feet of nothing, and talk about small things while the real conversation happened in the silence between our words. The brush of his shoulder against mine, the warmth of him in the cold desert night, the way neither of us moved away. He told me about his family, about his grandmother who had survived the long walk and carried the stories of it in her body like scars that showed only when she moved a certain way. About his mother, who had hidden him from the truant officers when they came to collect children for the boarding schools, hiding him under the floorboards of her hogan, while the officers searched, lying to their faces with a calm that terrified her afterward. About his uncle, who had taught him to forge, not just the skill of it, but the philosophy. That heat changes things. That pressure shapes things. That the strongest steel is the steel that has been through the fire the most times. Your father understood that, Neil said one night, the two of us sitting on the rim with nothing but starlight and the sound of the wind. The fire, he had been through it, and it made him the kind of man who helps people he does not have to help. I wish I had known him, I said. The man he was out here, not the man I remember. Maybe you did know him. Maybe the man who left was the same man who stayed. Maybe he just could not show you both at the same time. I did not know what to say to that. So I sat in the dark and felt the warmth of his shoulder against mine, and thought about my father chipping at stone in this same canyon alone, in the cold year after year, and I understood for the first time that love is not always something you can see. Sometimes it is something you have to listen for, the way you listen for water through stone. They came on a Tuesday in May. I heard the trucks before I saw them. The growl of engines echoing off the canyon walls, foreign and wrong, in a place that had known nothing but wind and silence for 10,000 years. Lark and I climbed to the rim and watched as a convoy of 3 vehicles pulled up to the edge of our land. 3 trucks, 7 men, and leading them stepping out of the first vehicle with the confidence of someone who believed he owned everything he could see was Colton Mercer. He was 48 years old, a rancher who had built his empire on land that the government had opened for settlement when the original inhabitants were sent to schools like St. Agnes to learn how to be something other than themselves. He owned thousands of acres, controlled most of the water rights in the county, and he had been watching our canyon for years, waiting for my father to die, waiting for the land to become available. "Good afternoon," he called up to us, shading his eyes against the sun. His voice was pleasant, friendly even. The voice of a man who had learned that the first weapon in any negotiation is the appearance of reasonableness. "You must be the Stone Creek girls. I am Colton Mercer. I own the property north of here." "We know who you are," Lark said. Her voice was flat and cold and carried no courtesy at all. Mercer's smile did not waver. "I wanted to introduce myself, welcome you to the area. It is not often we get newcomers out here." He paused. His eyes moved past us, scanning the canyon behind us, the narrow crack that dropped into the dark, calculating, measuring the way a man measures a thing he intends to own. "This is tough country for young people, especially young women on their own. If you ever need anything, supplies, help with the land, my door is always open." "We are fine," I said. "I am sure you are." He was still smiling, but his eyes had changed. The friendliness was still there on the surface, but underneath it, something else had moved into position, something patient and hard and accustomed to getting what it wanted. "Though I have to wonder what you are doing out here. This land has been worthless for decades. No water, no grass, no way to make a living. Your father must have known that." "Our father knew a lot of things," Lark said. Something flickered in Mercer's face, something ugly quickly hidden. "Yes, he did. We spoke several times, actually. He had some interesting ideas about this canyon." He paused, let the word hang. "Something about water, an underground river. I offered to buy this land from him, you know. Several times, offered him a fair price, more than fair given its condition. But he refused." He spread his hands in a gesture of innocent confusion. "I never understood why. There is nothing here." "Then why do you want it?" I asked. His smile sharpened. The mask slipped just a fraction, just enough for me to see the man behind it. "Call it concern. 3 young women alone in the desert. It is not safe. Anything could happen out here. Anything at all." Behind him, his men shifted. One of them, a big man with sunburned skin and a jaw like a shovel blade, cracked his knuckles slowly, deliberately, making sure we heard it. "We are not alone," I said, "and we are not leaving." Mercer looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded once, the way a man nods when a chess piece moves to the square he expected. "Well," he said, "that is a shame. I was hoping we could be neighbors." He turned back toward his truck. "But if you change your mind, if things get difficult out here, if the desert proves too much, remember my offer." He opened the truck door and paused. "I am a patient man, Miss Stone Creek, and this country has a way of breaking people who do not know what they are doing." He drove away. His men followed, and they left nothing but dust and silence and a cold weight in my stomach that had nothing to do with the canyon shade. "He knows," Lark said quietly, watching the dust settle. "He has been watching Dad all these years, waiting for him to find the water. And now he thinks we are going to find it for him." I looked down at the canyon, at the camp on the floor, at Fenn moving among the planting beds with his quiet, purposeful grace, at Neil emerging from the cavern entrance, the pickaxe over his shoulder, stone dust in his hair. "Then we need to find it first," I said. We worked harder after Mercer's visit. Longer hours, fewer breaks. The wall was getting thinner. I could measure it now with my hand pressing my palm against the stone and feeling the vibration of the water grow stronger each day, the pulse becoming a throb, the throb becoming a pressure that I could feel in my teeth. 3 feet, 2.5, 2. The stone between us and the river was running out, and the river was getting impatient. We broke through the wall on a Tuesday morning in June. I remember the exact moment because I have relived it every day since, and it has never lost its edge. never dulled, never become ordinary the way extraordinary things sometimes do when you handle them too often. Neil was swinging the pickaxe, a hard horizontal strike at a section of rock that had been weakened by 6 weeks of chipping, thinned to inches the last barrier between the underground river and the canyon that had been dry for 10,000 years. The point of the pickaxe punched through into emptiness, and there was a sound, not a crack, not a break, a gasp, as though the canyon itself had been holding its breath for 10 millennia and had finally let it go. The water came through the hole in a jet powerful enough to knock Neil flat on his back. It hit him in the chest and threw him 3 feet across the cavern floor, soaking him completely, blinding him with spray. He lay there in the sudden flood, sputtering, gasping, and then he did something I had never heard him do in the 6 weeks we had worked together. He laughed, a real laugh, full and startled and joyful, the laugh of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just set it down. The water poured over him, and he lay in it and laughed, and the sound bounced off the cavern walls and came back to us multiplied as though the stone itself were laughing with him. The water kept coming. It poured through the hole we had made, widening it with its own pressure, following the channel we had cut for it, with perfect, patient, irresistible certainty. The certainty of something that has been waiting and has finally been given permission to move. Lark was screaming, not in fear, in something beyond joy, beyond relief, beyond any word I know, for the feeling of watching the impossible become real in front of your eyes. She was standing in the flood with her arms raised and her face turned up to the spray, laughing and crying at the same time, the water streaming down her face and mixing with her tears until you could not tell which was which. She looked like a woman being baptized. She looked like a woman being born. And Fen was on his knees at the edge of the growing stream, his hands in the water, his lips moving. And then I heard it. Not a whisper, not a murmur. A voice, his voice, rough from 6 years of disuse. Cracked and uncertain, like a door being opened for the first time in years, the hinges stiff, the wood swollen but opening. The words came slow and imperfect, but they came and they were unmistakable. He was saying the water prayer, the one our mother had taught us before she died. The blessing for the gift of flowing water in a dry land, spoken in the language of our ancestors, returned to us at last. The language the boarding school had beaten and shamed and punished out of us. The language Fen had refused to let go of, even in silence, carrying it inside him like a seed buried in dry earth, waiting for water. To'ei ina, Fen said. Water is life. I dropped to my knees beside him, put my hand in the current. The water was cold. Not mountain cold, but desert cold. The deep, constant chill of water that had traveled through stone for 60 miles, filtered and purified by the rock itself. I cupped my hand and drank. It tasted like stone and time and clean darkness. It tasted like every prayer I had forgotten how to say, and I spoke the words with him. And Lark came and knelt beside us, her voice cracking, uncertain, dredging the syllables up from a place she had tried to bury them, but they were still there, still alive, still hers. And Niall listened from where he lay in the flood, his eyes closed, his face peaceful, hearing a language his grandmother had spoken and his mother had remembered and he had thought would die in his generation. And the canyon walls caught our voices and held them the way they had held the water for 10,000 years. The river flowed, and it kept flowing. Out of the cavern through the channel we had cut onto the canyon floor, where the ancient soil had been waiting. And wherever the water touched, the dust darkened and the earth softened and the air itself seemed to change, thickening with moisture, carrying the smell of wet stone and new beginnings and the end of a 10,000-year drought. We planted that same week. Fen had the beds ready. I put Navajo white corn in first, the variety our mother had grown in her own garden, the variety that Diné farmers had been cultivating in the desert for 1,000 years, bred for exactly these conditions. Intense sun, alkaline soil, limited water, seeds that carried the memory of every drought they had ever survived. The canyon was a greenhouse made of stone, warm at night because the sandstone walls absorbed the sunlight and radiated heat through the darkness. Cool during the day because the depth provided shade for most of the hours. 90 minutes of direct sunlight was enough. Desert sun is concentrated, powerful, and the canyon walls reflected additional light onto the floor, creating a bright, diffused glow that reached every corner. The corn went in as seed in early June. By the end of the month, green shoots were pushing through the dark soil. By July, the stalks were waist-high and climbing. By August, they would be taller than a man. But I did not know that yet. All I knew was that something was growing in a place where nothing had grown for 10,000 years. And every morning when I checked the beds and saw the stalks a little taller, the leaves a little broader, the green a little deeper, I felt my father standing beside me. Not a ghost, not a memory, a presence, as real as the corn, as patient as the water. But the corn was not the only thing growing. They came at night, 3 of Mercer's men. I woke to shouts in the darkness, to larks screaming somewhere below the rim, to the sound of boots on stone and men's voices raised in anger and the heavy wet thud of rocks being thrown into water. They had blocked the irrigation channel, the one we had spent 2 weeks chipping through solid rock to create. 3 men with shovels and pickaxes piling stones into the channel trying to dam the water, trying to undo in one night what 6 weeks of labor had built. Lark was fighting them. She had grabbed one man's shovel and was swinging it like a weapon, the blade whistling through the dark air, keeping them back through sheer fury and the unwillingness to calculate the odds. One woman against 3 men, 15 years old and maybe 110 pounds, and fighting like something out of the old stories, the ones the nuns had tried to make us forget, the ones about women who defended their land with nothing but rage and the refusal to surrender it. But she was losing ground. They were bigger, stronger, and in the flickering light of their lanterns, I saw blood on her face where someone had struck her. A cut above her left eye streaming red down her cheek, and she had not even wiped it away, had not even noticed it. She was too busy trying to kill a man with a shovel. I fired the rifle into the air. It was the old Winchester that Hostine had left us. A lever action that had belonged to my father, the stock worn smooth by his hands, the barrel cold in the night air. The crack of it echoed off the canyon walls like thunder bouncing from one side to the other and back again until it sounded like a dozen guns firing the canyon, multiplying the sound the way it multiplied everything, holding it, amplifying it, turning one shot into a war. The men froze, and in that moment of stillness, I stepped into the lantern light and pointed the rifle at the nearest man's chest. "Get out," I said, "now. Wait just a minute. Get out of my canyon, get off my land, and tell Colton Mercer that if he sends anyone else, I will not fire a warning shot next time." They looked at each other, then at Lark, who had picked up a rock the size of a grapefruit and was holding it like she was ready to crush a skull with it. Then at Fenn, who had appeared silently behind them from somewhere in the darkness, a knife in his hand, 12 years old and not saying a word, not making a sound, just standing there with his mother's eyes and his father's stubbornness in a blade that caught the lantern light. Then at Neil, who had climbed down from the rim with the pickaxe and was standing at the base of the wall blocking their exit, covered in stone dust and shadow and absolutely still. The stillness of a man who has already decided what he is willing to do and is simply waiting to see if it will be necessary. They left. They climbed the wall in the dark, scrambling, cursing, and one of them slipped and fell 10 feet before catching himself, and I did not care whether he was hurt or not. And as the last one pulled himself over the rim, he called back down to us. "Mercer is a patient man. He will wait you out. Nobody lasts forever in this desert." I lowered the rifle. My arms were shaking. The adrenaline was leaving my body and taking everything solid with it, replacing bone with water, replacing certainty with the sick, hollow feeling of having pointed a gun at another human being and meaning it. Lark was sitting on the ground. The blood from the cut above her eye had run down the side of her face and dried in dark streaks. She looked like a warrior. She looked like a child. She looked like both at the same time, and the contradiction of it broke something in me that I did not have time to fix. "Are you all right?" I asked. "They blocked the channel. Some of the stones are still in there." I asked if you were all right. She looked up at me, and for the first time since we were children, since before our mother died and our father left and the school took everything we had, she looked like she might tell me the truth. "No," she said, "I am not all right. I have not been all right for a very long time." Neil knelt beside her and looked at the cut. "It needs cleaning," he said, "and it will scar." "Good," Lark said. "I want to remember." We cleared the channel by morning. The water flowed again, and the corn, which had been submerged for hours, straightened itself in the sunlight as though nothing had happened. Corn is resilient that way, It remembers how to stand up after being knocked down. It has been doing it for 10,000 years. Word of what happened spread through the reservation the way water spreads through sandstone. Slowly at first, seeping through the cracks between families, between hogans, between trading posts and chapter houses, and the quiet places where people gathered to talk about the things that mattered. And then all at once, the way an underground river breaks through a wall. The Stone Creek sisters had stood up to Mercer. Three young women had defended their land against men who thought they could take anything they wanted because they had always been able to take anything they wanted. Within a week, there were Navajo men camped on the canyon rim, relatives of people we had fed, sons of families my father had helped years ago during the stock reduction, during the hard winters, during the years when Harlan Stone Creek had driven hundreds of miles to testify at hearings for people who were not his blood because he believed that what was happening to them was wrong. They came with rifles and blankets and coffee pots and a simple message that did not need to be spoken aloud because it was written in their presence. This canyon was not unprotected. These children were not alone. And the next man Colton Mercer sent down that wall would not be climbing back up. Opal Clearwater came the following week. She was 62 years old, a healer and herbalist who lived 15 miles south near the trading post. Hostine had told her about the canyon, about the water, about three half Navajo children growing corn in a place the government had valued at $10. We lowered her into the canyon on the rope system. She gripped the rope with hands stronger than they looked and did not close her eyes once during the descent, keeping them fixed on the canyon floor below, as though she were reading it. She stood on the canyon floor, surrounded by green corn and running water. She pressed her palms together and closed her eyes. When she opened them, there were tears on her face. "I will teach you," she said, "what the desert knows about feeding people, what the schools never taught you because they did not want you to know." She looked at me. "Your mother would have taught you herself if she had lived. So I will do it for her and for your father, and for every child who was taken from a family that knew how to grow things and put in a school that only knew how to cut things down." She left the next morning, but she came back every month, and she brought seeds and knowledge. And the slow, patient certainty that what we were doing in this canyon was not just farming, it was remembering. The canyon farm grew with a speed that astonished everyone, including me. The combination was something no agricultural textbook had ever described because no agricultural textbook had ever imagined it. Rich alluvial soil preserved for 10,000 years beneath 200 feet of protective stone. Constant water filtered through 60 miles of sandstone aquifer, cold and clean and mineral-rich, riving with the patience of something that had been traveling for 2 years before it reached us. And a microclimate that the canyon walls created without anyone asking them to. Warm in winter because the stone absorbed the desert sunlight all day and radiated heat through the night like a furnace built by God. Cool in summer because the depth provided shade for most of the daylight hours, keeping the temperature 15 degrees below the rim. 90 minutes of direct sunlight was enough. Desert sun is not like other sun. It is concentrated, fierce, and the canyon walls reflected additional light onto the floor, bouncing it back and forth between the sandstone surfaces, creating a bright, diffused glow that reached into every corner and shadow. The plants did not just survive in that light. They thrived in it. They grew as though they had been waiting for this exact combination of conditions and had finally found it and were determined to make up for 10,000 years of empty soil. I planted Navajo white corn first, the variety our mother had grown in her own garden before she died, the variety that DNA farmers had been planting in the desert for 1,000 years, selecting the strongest ears each season, saving the best seeds, breeding a plant that was not just adapted to harsh conditions, but designed for them. A plant that understood drought the way a fish understands water. That knew how to pull moisture from alkaline soil and turn brutal sun into sugar and grow tall and green and impossibly alive in a place where nothing should have been able to grow at all. It went in as seed in early June. By August, it was 7 feet tall. The stalks grew thick and lush, their leaves broad and dark green, rustling in the faint breeze that moved through the canyon at midday. The silk tassels caught the noon light and glowed like threads spun from metal, and the ears swelled heavy on the stalks, and the canyon floor that had been nothing but dust and stone 3 months before was now a garden. The squash spread across the ground in broad, leathery leaves that shaded the soil, and held the moisture in. The beans climbed the corn stalks the way DNA farmers had trained them to for centuries, winding upward, fixing nitrogen in the soils they grew, feeding the corn that supported them. The three sisters, corn and squash and beans, each one sustaining the others in a system so elegant and so ancient that it made the monoculture farming I had read about in the school library look like something a child would design. Three sisters growing in a canyon left to three sisters. I do not know if my father planned the symbolism or if the land simply understood what we needed better than we did. Opal Clearwater came to see the harvest in September. She had been coming every month since that first visit, bringing seeds and knowledge and the patient certainty that only comes from a woman who has spent 62 years learning from a land that most people thought had nothing to teach. But this visit was different. This time there was something to see. She stood on the canyon floor, surrounded by green corn, taller than her head, and running water that caught the light, and squash vines spreading in every direction, like the canyon was exhaling after holding its breath for 100 centuries. She pressed her palms together and closed her eyes, and when she opened them, there were tears on her weathered face. "Your father was not dreaming," she said. "He was waiting for the three of you to come and wake this place up." Over the weeks and months that followed, Opal taught me what the desert knew about feeding people that the books at St. Agnes had never mentioned. How to read soil by its smell, sweet for fertile, sour for alkaline, bitter for poison. How to watch the way water moved across the ground and let it tell you where the channel should go. How to use flood irrigation the old way, periodic deep watering followed by dry periods that forced roots to dig deeper to search to become strong in the searching. How to save seeds in clay jars sealed with pine pitch, each jar holding a lineage of survival that stretched back further than any written history. Each variety carrying the memory of every season it had survived. But the most important thing Opal taught me had nothing to do with farming. "The people remember your father," she told me one evening, while we shelled corn together in the fading light. The stone walls around us turned from red to gold to amber to purple, each color lasting only a minute before the next one arrived, a slow performance that the canyon had been giving for 10,000 years to an audience of no one. Until now. Not because he was Navajo, he was only half, not because he was powerful. He had nothing. They remember him because he showed up. When the government came to take the sheep, he showed up. When families needed someone to write letters they could not write themselves, he showed up. When people needed a witness at a hearing 200 miles away in the middle of January, he drove through the snow and he showed up. She looked at me with eyes that had seen everything. The stock reduction that destroyed the Navajo pastoral economy, the boarding schools that stole children from their families, the war that was now taking the young men who had survived all of that. That is the rarest thing in this world, Ren. Not talent, not money, not even love. Just showing up. Just being there when it is hard and thankless and no one is watching. "I did not know," I said. "He never told us any of that." "He did not want you to know. He was afraid." She paused, chose her words with the care of someone who understood that words like seeds could grow into things you did not intend. "He was afraid that if you knew how hard he had tried to get you back and failed, you would hate him even more than you already did." The weight of that settled over me like a stone placed on a grave. "We did not hate him," I said. "We thought he had abandoned us. We thought he did not care." "He cared too much," Opal said. "That was always his problem. He carried those letters, every one the school returned, right here." She touched her chest, close to his heart, until the day he died. I did not know what to say to that, so I sat in the growing dark and listened to the river that my father had died trying to reach, and felt the weight of everything he had sacrificed for three children he could not save. Three children who had hated him for saving them in the only way he could. "The people will help you," Opal said finally. "When you need it, you are not strangers here, Ren. You are family, his family, and that makes you ours." December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The news came slowly to the canyon country. No radios, no newspapers, just the occasional visitor bringing word from the outside world the way travelers have always brought word on foot and on horseback and in the beds of trucks that rattled over dirt roads that were barely roads at all. But when the news arrived, it changed everything. War with Japan, young men being called up from every corner of the country, draft notices arriving at Hogan's and trading posts and chapter houses. The reservation, already poor, already stretched thin by decades of government programs designed to reduce its self-sufficiency, was now being asked to send its sons to fight for the same country that had taken their land and their children and their sheep and their language. And the sons went. They went because their grandmothers told them that you do not protect only the parts of a country that have been good to you. You protect the land itself, because the land is older than any government and will outlast every policy and every injustice and every program designed to diminish you. The land is the thing that remains when everything else has been taken, and the land was worth fighting for. Neil received his orders 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor. He was being assigned to a special unit. The letter said communications. They wanted him because he could speak DNA fluently, because the language was complex enough and rare enough and unknown enough to the enemy that it could not be broken. Because the government that had spent 50 years trying to erase his language from the face of the earth now needed it to win a war. I read the letter twice before the irony stopped choking me. The night before he left, we sat together on the canyon rim. The stars were so thick overhead that the sky looked like a river of light flowing in the opposite direction from the one we had freed below. The desert stretched out in every direction, vast and dark and silent, and somewhere out there beyond the horizon was an ocean, and beyond the ocean was a war, and beyond the war was a future that neither of us could see. Neil had been with us for 7 months. He had helped break through the wall. He had helped plant the first crops. He had stood beside me when Mercer's men came in the night, and he had not flinched, and he had not left. He had become part of whatever this was, whatever we were building in the place my father had left us. And now he was going to a place where men died in numbers too large to comprehend, using a language that had almost been killed to keep other men alive. "I will come back," he said. "You do not have to promise that." "I know." He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that means someone is choosing between saying something and keeping it inside forever. "But I am promising anyway, because when I come back, I am going to ask you something, and I want you to be ready." I knew what he meant. I had known for weeks, maybe months. The way you know the sun is going to rise even when the sky is still dark. The way you know water is behind a wall even before you hear it. Some things announce themselves in silence, in the space between words, in the brush of a hand against a hand when a tool is being passed, in the way someone says your name as though it were a word they had been practicing in private. "Ask me now," I said. He shook his head, slowly, the way Fen shook his head, with certainty. "No, you need to see if I am the kind of man who keeps his promises first." He stood up and brushed the red dust from his pants. He looked down at me, and in the starlight his face was the color of the canyon walls, and his eyes held the same patience the stone held, the willingness to wait for as long as it took. "Take care of the canyon, Wren. Take care of your brother and sister. And when I come back, I will be here." He nodded once, and then he walked back down into the canyon. And in the morning, before the sun reached the floor, he was gone. And the place where he had slept was empty and cool and held the shape of him for a few hours before the wind smoothed it away. The war years were hard in a way that I did not know things could be hard. With the young men gone, sent to Europe and the Pacific, in a dozen places whose names I could not pronounce, the reservations, farms, and herds fell into the hands of women and children and the elderly. But the reservation had already been poor before the war. The livestock herds had been forcibly reduced by the government years earlier in a program that had destroyed the Navajo pastoral economy more thoroughly than any drought or disease could have managed. People were hungry, hungry in the way that the desert makes especially cruel. A hunger surrounded by endless sky and red beauty that you cannot eat, that mocks you with its vastness while your stomach folds in on itself. Government rations were thin and unreliable. Bags of white flour and canned meat that arrived weeks late or not at all, distributed by bureaucrats who kept careful records of what they sent and kept no records of what arrived. I carried food out of the canyon on my back every morning, up the wall at dawn, canvas sacks of dried corn and squash and beans strapped to my shoulders with rope that cut into my skin through my shirt. 200 feet of vertical stone, climbed in the half-dark, my hands finding the holds by memory. Now my father's route as familiar to me as the corridors of St. Agnes had once been. My arms burned, my shoulders ached, ached. The rope left marks on my palms that became blisters, that became calluses, that became scars that I would carry for the rest of my life. Down the wall at dusk, empty-handed, exhausted, my shoulders aching and my palms burned raw by the rope, ready to sleep for 4 hours and do it all again tomorrow. I walked miles across the desert to families who needed what we had. I did not ride. We had no horse. I walked carrying food on my back the way my father had walked carrying hope in his heart. I asked nothing in return. People gave what they could: wool, woven blankets, labor in the canyon during planting and harvest season. An old woman named Justine Begay gave me a turquoise bracelet her grandmother had made. The stones were small and rough, and the silver was tarnished almost black, but it was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever given me, and I wore it every day for the rest of my life. Some of the families I visited had sons overseas, mothers who had not heard from their boys in months, fathers who sat by the road and watched for the government car that might bring the telegram they prayed would never come. I brought them corn and squash and whatever else I could carry, and I sat with them, and I did not say it would be all right because I did not know if it would be. I just showed up, the way my father had showed up. The way Opal had told me was the rarest thing. Lark expanded the irrigation system. She chipped a second channel through the cavern wall, working alone for 3 weeks, doubling the water flow and extending the farmed area to cover nearly the entire canyon floor. She planted fruit trees in the warmest section of the canyon, peach and apricot varieties that Navajo farmers had grown since the Spanish brought them 3 centuries ago. The reflected heat from the south-facing wall kept frost at bay even in January, and the trees took root in the deep alluvial soil as though they had been waiting for someone to plant them there. She was 17 now, and she had not softened. But the fury that had driven her at 15, the blind white rage that had made her swing a shovel at a man twice her size in the dark, had changed into something else, something more useful. She still fought. She would always fight. But now she fought with channels and irrigation and stone, and the patient, relentless certainty that the best revenge against people who said your land was worthless was to make it feed everyone they had forgotten. Fenn managed the storage and distribution. He kept careful records in small notebooks tracking what we had grown, what we had stored, what we could spare, writing in a handwriting that was neat and precise and looked nothing like our father's, but carried the same stubborn belief that if you wrote something down, it became real. He was 14 now, and he had not stopped speaking since the day the water broke through the wall. His voice was still quiet, still rough around the edges, the way a tool is rough when it has not been used in years. But it was there, and he used it for something the nuns at St. Agnes would have called rebellion, and I called restoration. He taught the children, the ones who came with their mothers and grandmothers to work the harvest. Children who had never been to the boarding schools because their parents had hidden them or lied about their ages or simply refused to let them go. Children who spoke English and understood it but had never been taught their own language because their parents were afraid. Afraid that if the children learned Diné, the government would come and take them away to a school where they would learn to be ashamed of it. Fenn taught them in the canyon, sitting in the shade of the cornstalks, his voice low and patient, going over the sounds and the words and the songs that our mother had taught us before she died. The songs the boarding school had tried to beat out of us. The songs Fenn had carried inside his silence for 6 years, like seeds stored in a sealed jar, waiting for the right conditions to grow. It was a small rebellion, a boy teaching children a language in a canyon. But revolutions are not always loud. Sometimes they are as quiet as a voice learning to speak again, as quiet as water moving through stone. Mercer came back one final time, not with men and shovels, with lawyers and documents, in the particular kind of violence that wears a suit and speaks in measured tones and destroys lives by citing subsection and paragraph. He filed a claim in the county court, argued that the Stone Creek homestead had been abandoned, that the original filing was invalid because Harlan Stone Creek had been half Indian, and therefore under the interpretation of the law that Mercer's attorneys preferred ineligible to file a homestead claim in 1912. He argued that the land had reverted to the public domain and that he, Colton Mercer, had a superior right to it by virtue of his adjacent holdings and his long-standing interest in the property. It was a lie built on a technicality wrapped in a century of laws designed to separate indigenous people from their land. And it almost worked. The judge in the first hearing seemed sympathetic to Mercer's position. The paperwork was complicated, the legal history was tangled, and Mercer had money for lawyers, and we had nothing but a canyon and a river and 47 letters that a dead man had written to children who never received them. But he had not counted on Opal Clearwater. She testified at the hearing in Mexican hat on a Tuesday morning in March of 1943. She wore her best turquoise, her silver, her hair braided and wrapped in the traditional way. She walked into that courtroom the way she walked into everything, slowly and deliberately, and without any interest in whether the people around her approved of her presence. She brought records, letters Harlan had written to government officials, receipts from the filing fees he had paid, witnesses who remembered him registering the homestead, a man who had stood in line behind him at the land office, a clerk who remembered processing the paperwork, an attorney from Flagstaff who had helped Harlan navigate the requirements, and who testified under oath that mixed-blood individuals were legally entitled to file homestead claims and always had been. She brought copies of the government's own documents pulled from archives that Mercer's lawyers had not thought to check, proving that the interpretation of the law they were relying on had been rejected by the courts 3 separate times in the previous 2 decades. And then she brought the letters, 47 envelopes, each one stamped in red ink. Return to sender, address unknown. She laid them on the table in front of the judge one by one, taking her time, letting the weight of them accumulate, letting the courtroom see what 6 years of institutional cruelty looked like when you spread it out on a table. These letters, Opal said, and her voice was steady and clear and carried to every corner of that small courtroom, were written by a father to his children. Every week for 6 years, he wrote to them about the law, about his fight to get them back, about the canyon and the water and the life he was trying to build for them. And every single letter was returned by the school that was supposed to be caring for his children. Returned without being delivered. Without the children ever knowing their father had written. She paused. Let the silence do its work. The courtroom was quiet in the way that places become quiet when something true has been spoken, and everyone in the room knows it. 3 children spent 6 years believing their father had abandoned them. And now a man who owns more land than he can see from the highest point on his property wants to take the only thing their father was able to leave them. She looked at Mercer. He looked back at her. And for the first time since I had known him, since that first afternoon, when he had stood at the rim of our canyon and smiled his pleasant smile and made his reasonable threats, Colton Mercer looked uncertain. Not frightened, not defeated, uncertain. The look of a man who has been playing a game and has just realized that the rules have changed and the new rules do not favor him. The judge was a Navajo man named Benali. He had lost 2 of his own children to the boarding schools. He had sent them off in a government truck when they were 6 and 8 years old, and they had come back speaking English and ashamed of their own names, and he had spent the rest of his life trying to undo the damage, and knowing that some of it could not be undone. He knew what those red stamps meant. He knew what it cost a family to be separated by a system that called itself education and operated like exile. He looked at the letters for a long time, picked up one, opened it, read the first few lines. Put it down. Picked up another. Read that one too. His face did not change, but his hands were not steady, and when he put the second letter down, I saw him touch his chest briefly the way Hostine had told me my father touched his chest, where he kept our photographs. The gesture of a man reaching for something he has lost. Then he looked at Mercer and his team of lawyers in their pressed suits with their folders of documents and their carefully constructed arguments about subsections and eligibility and legal interpretation. The claim is valid, Judge Benali said. The land belongs to the Stone Creek children. Case dismissed. Mercer stood up. He looked at me across the courtroom. And I saw something in his face that was not anger. It was recognition. The understanding that he had lost, not because of a technicality or a sympathetic judge, but because of 47 letters and a dead man's love for his children in a system that had tried to destroy a family and had failed because the family was stronger than the system. He walked out of the courtroom without speaking, and he never came back to our canyon again. That night, back in the canyon, clearing out a section of the cavern, where the wall met the floor, Fenn found a small metal box hidden in a crack in the stone. It was rusted almost shut, the kind of rust that takes years to accumulate, the slow, patient corrosion of metal surrounded by damp air and time. He brought it to me without a word and sat down beside me as I worked the lid open with a knife. Inside was one more letter, one final letter. This one not addressed to us, not mailed, not stamped, not meant to be found until now, until we had done what he could not. Until the water was flowing and the corn was growing and the canyon had been woken from its 10,000-year sleep. My dearest children, if you are reading this, then you have found the water. You have done what I could not do. You have opened the wall. I am sorry I was not there to help you. I am sorry for every day we were apart, every birthday I missed, every time you needed me and I could not come. But I want you to know something. The water that flows through this cavern has been traveling for 2 years before it reaches you. Snow falls on mountains 60 miles from here. It melts, seeps into the earth, travels through fractures in the sandstone aquifer, filtered and purified by the rock moving through darkness and silence, and stone for 730 days before it emerges here clean and cold and alive. 2 years. That is what the mountains give to this canyon. Not just water, time. All the time the mountains can hold filtered through stone, arriving when it is needed, steady and patient, and impossible to stop. That is what I wanted to give you. Not just land, not just water, time. All the time I had. Every year I spent looking for this place, every letter I wrote, every night I slept on the cold ground, listening for the river through the rock. It was all time. My time. Given to you, filtered through years of separation and silence and failure, but arriving. Finally arriving. I love you. I love your mother. I will love you beyond my last breath, beyond whatever comes after, beyond anything this world or any system or any school or any government can take from me. The canyon remembers even when we forget. So will I, your father Harlan. I read the letter 3 times before I could speak. The words blurred and cleared and blurred again, and I let them because some things are meant to be seen through tears. Some things are meant to be read with the eyes that grief gives you, the ones that see further and deeper than the eyes you use for ordinary things. Lark stood with her back to us. Her shoulders were shaking. I had seen her fight 3 men in the dark. I had seen her chip through solid rock for 6 weeks without complaint. I had seen her stand in a courtroom and stare down a man who wanted to take everything we had. But I had never seen her break like this. The walls she had built around herself, the walls that were harder than the sandstone and took longer to form, came down all at once, silent and complete. And for the first time I understood that the walls had not been protecting her from the world. They had been protecting the world from the grief inside her. And now the grief was out, and it was enormous, and it filled the cavern the way the water filled the cavern, and there was no stopping it and no controlling it and no reason to try. Fen leaned against my shoulder. His lips were moving. He was saying the words from the letter in Diné, translating them as he read, giving our father's English words the sound of our mother's language. And I realized that this was what Fen had been doing all along. Not just carrying the language, bridging it, connecting the two halves of who we were, the father who wrote in English and the mother who sang in Diné, the boarding school that tried to erase us, and the canyon that was teaching us to remember. And the canyon held our voices the way it held the water, the way it held everything that mattered. Neo came home in the summer of 1945. He was different, quieter in a way that was different from his old quietness. The patience was still there, but it had been joined by something else, a heaviness, a shadow that moved behind his eyes and sometimes surfaced when he thought no one was looking. Whatever he had seen in the Pacific, whatever messages he had encoded and decoded in the language they had tried to take from him, whatever battles he had helped win with the words his grandmother had spoken and his mother had remembered, and the boarding schools had tried to destroy, it had changed him in ways I would spend years learning to understand. There were things he would not talk about, islands whose names he would not say, nights he would not describe. He told me once, years later, that the hardest part was not the danger. The hardest part was speaking his grandmother's language while men died around him, using the words she had used to sing him to sleep as a child to coordinate artillery strikes. The beauty of the language and the ugliness of what it was being used for existed inside each other, and he could not separate them, and he was not sure he ever would. He climbed down into the canyon on a day in July when the peach trees were heavy with fruit and the corn was taller than a man and the water ran clear and cold through channels of living stone. He stood on the canyon floor and looked at what we had built. The corn, the squash, the beans, the fruit trees, the irrigation channels, the planting beds that Fen had prepared and I had sown, and Lark had defended with a shovel, and a fury that would become a family legend. His face changed. The shadow retreated just for a moment, pushed back by something stronger. "I told them about this," he said. His voice was rough. "The other code talkers. During the worst of it, when we were on islands, whose names I still cannot say without feeling the ground shake, I told them there were 3 sisters farming inside a canyon in Utah, growing corn in a place everyone said was dead, using water that everyone said did not exist." He paused, swallowed. "They thought I was making it up. They said nobody could farm a canyon. I said I knew 3 women who could farm a crack in hell if you gave them enough stubbornness and a pickaxe." "You were not making it up," I said. "I know." He looked at me, the same look he had given me the night before he left on the canyon rim under the stars. "That is what made it worth telling. That is what made everything worth getting through." "Ask me now," I said, and he did. "We married in the canyon in the autumn of 1946. Hosteen Nez performed the ceremony in the old way, speaking the words in DNA, his voice echoing off the walls that had held so many voices before ours. Opal Clearwater stood beside us with tears on her face. Lark stood behind me, her hand on my shoulder, and I could feel the strength in her grip, in the love behind it, in the fierce protectiveness that said, if anyone tried to ruin this moment, she would destroy them with her bare hands. Fen stood beside Neol, holding a bundle of sage and cedar, his face quiet and full, and finally at peace. The corn was golden around us. The water sang over the stones, and the canyon held the ceremony the way it held everything. Gently, completely, without letting go. Lark married a young man named Walter Yazzie the following year, a quiet, steady man who had lost his brothers in the war and found in Lark someone who understood what it meant to survive something that should have killed you and keep going anyway. Not because you were brave, but because stopping was not something your body knew how to do. They were good together in the way that 2 broken things can be good together when they break along different lines and the jagged edges fit. He gave her steadiness. She gave him fire. And between them, they built something that neither could have built alone. She raised 5 children on a ranch they built north of the canyon. She never fully lost her edge. Even at 60, she could outwork women half her age and intimidate men twice her size with a look that carried the memory of every fight she had ever fought and every wall she had ever broken through. But the fury that had defined her at 15 had transformed over the decades into something else. A fierce protectiveness. A love so intense it frightened people who did not understand that love and rage can come from the same place and sometimes they are the same thing. She never talked about St. Agnes. But every year on the anniversary of the day we left, she would climb down into the canyon alone and sit by the water and put her hand on the stone wall and listen. I never asked what she heard. Some things are private. Some rivers only speak to one person at a time. Fen never married. He became a teacher, walking between the reservation schools and the canyon, teaching children the language and the farming techniques their parents had been forbidden to learn. His students called him the quiet teacher. He never raised his voice, never needed to. He taught the way water shapes stone, slowly, persistently, with a patience that outlasted every obstacle, not by fighting it, but by flowing around it and continuing on the other side. He taught hundreds of children over the decades. Some of them became teachers themselves. Some of them taught their own children the language Fen had given them, the language he had carried in his silence for 6 years and then spent the rest of his life giving away. A chain of voices stretching forward into a future he could not see but trusted to exist, because that is what rivers do. They flow forward even in the dark. And he never stopped drawing. The notebooks filled up, dozens of them, then scores, then hundreds. He drew everything, the canyon in every season and every light. The river at dawn when the water was silver, and at noon when it was gold, and at dusk when it was the color of the stone, and you could not tell where the water ended and the canyon began. The corn at every stage of growth from seed to silk to harvest. The faces of the children he taught, their mouths open in the shapes of words they were learning to say. The hands of the women who worked the harvest, strong and brown and cracked from the work and beautiful. And sometimes late at night he would draw our mother. The same face, the same eyes, over and over again, as though he were still afraid of forgetting, as though each drawing were still a spell, as though the boss who had stopped speaking for 6 years was still trying to say the one thing that mattered most in the only language that had never failed him. Neil and I built a house against the south wall of the canyon, sandstone and juniper, cool in summer, warm in winter, with windows that framed the strip of sky above like paintings that changed every hour. Blue in the morning, white at noon, gold and orange and purple at sunset, dark and filled with stars at night. We had 4 children, 3 daughters and a son. They grew up climbing the canyon walls like lizards swimming in the underground river, speaking Diné and English with equal ease, moving between the two languages the way the canyon moved between shadow and light. They learned to farm the way Opal had taught me, with respect for water and patience for the desert's rhythms, and the understanding that you do not conquer dry land. You negotiate with it. You listen to what it needs and you give it that, and in return it gives you what you need, and the negotiation never ends because the land is always changing, and so are you. They knew the story. I told them all of it. The school, the letters, the laughter at the trading post, the night Mercer's men came the day the water broke through. I told them because stories are seeds too, and if you do not plant them, they die. And if you plant them, they grow into things that outlast the person who told them. Opal Clearwaters died in 1958 at 79. In her hogan near the trading post, with the smell of sage in the air and the sound of wind against the windows. I was with her at the end. She held my hand and looked at me with eyes that had outlasted everything the world had tried to use to close them. "You did well, little bird," she said. She was the only one who still called me that, translating my name from English into Diné. "Your father would be proud. I wish he could have seen it. He can." She closed her eyes. "The water remembers. So does the stone. Everything we do here, everything we build and plant and grow becomes part of the land. He is here, Ren. He always was. From the moment you pressed your hand to that wall and felt the river pulse, he was there. On the other side, pressing back." She stopped breathing a few minutes later, quiet as a candle going out. I buried her turquoise bracelet with her, the one her grandmother had made the twin of the one she had given me when I was 18, and frightened and did not know if I would survive. And I planted Navajo white corn on the path to her door, because she had told me once that corn was the closest thing to prayer that grew from the ground. Niall died in the autumn of 1980, in the canyon. On a day when the cottonwood trees we had planted near the river channel had turned gold, and the light that filtered through their leaves was the color of honey, and the air was cool and still, and smelled like water and stone, and the end of something. He was 58 years old. His heart had been weakening for years. The doctor said it was something he had carried home from the war, some invisible wound that had taken decades to finally reach the place it had been aiming for all along. A delayed detonation. A mine buried in his chest that the war had planted and time had triggered. He died in the afternoon, sitting in the chair by the window of the house we had built together, looking out at the canyon he had helped bring back to life. I was beside him. I had been beside him all day because I knew the way. You know some things without being told, the way Fen had known our father was gone before anyone told him. The old sight, our mother had called it. Maybe it was just love, not sight at all. Maybe it was just love. Maybe love knows when it is about to lose something, the way water knows when the wall is about to break. His last words were in Diné, a phrase his grandmother had taught him. I will not write it here because some words are private and some languages are not meant to be shared with everyone, and some things belong only to the 2 people who heard them. I buried him on the rim, where he could see the desert stretching to the horizon in every direction. The vast red silent land that had tested us and hurt us and taken from us and given us everything we needed. I put him where the stars were closest and the wind was strongest, and the canyon was a dark line below a crack in the earth that held everything we had built and everything we were and everything we would become. I kept farming. I was 60 by then, and my children had taken over most of the work. But I still climbed down into the canyon every morning to check the water, to put my hand on the stone wall and feel the vibration of the river inside it, to say the water prayer my mother had taught me in a language that had almost been silenced and was not and would not be and could not be because languages are like rivers. They go underground when they must. They travel through stone. They emerge where they are needed, and they do not stop. Some mornings when the light was right and the canyon was quiet and the water made its sound against the stone, I could hear my father's voice in the current, could feel him standing beside me, his hand on my shoulder, proud of what we had built in the place he had left us. Not proud the way the world means proud, loud and public, and demanding to be seen. Proud the way water is proud, quiet and deep and flowing in the direction it has always flowed, regardless of what anyone thinks of it. I died in the spring of 1987, at 64. They found me in the cavern, sitting beside the river, my hand in the water, my eyes closed. Ren, my daughter said I looked like I was listening. My son said I looked like I had finally heard the answer to a question I had been asking all my life. Maybe I had. Maybe the answer was the sound of water moving through stone. Maybe it was the feeling of cold current against my palm. Maybe it was my father's voice carried on the river, saying the words he had written in that last letter. The canyon remembers, so will I. Maybe the answer was simpler than any of that. Maybe it was just this, that a man who had nothing gave everything he had to children he could not reach, and the gift traveled through years of stone and silence, and arrived when it was needed, and the children opened the wall and the water remembered, and so did the father, and that was enough. That was everything. Fenn died 2 years later in 1989. They found his notebooks, hundreds of them, filled with drawings, the canyon in every season, the river in every light, the corn at every stage of growth, the faces of the children he had taught, the hands of the women who had worked the harvest, the stars as seen from the canyon floor framed by 200 feet of red stone on either side, and on the last page of the last notebook, a portrait, our mother, as young and beautiful as the day she died, drawn from a memory that had never faded, drawn with hands that had once refused to communicate with the world and had spent the rest of their life drawing it in every detail, preserving it, holding it the way the canyon holds water, the way stone holds warmth, the way silence holds the shape of every word that was ever spoken into it. The canyon farm is still producing. My grandchildren run it now and their children after them, growing Navajo white corn and squash and beans and peaches in a crack in the earth that the government valued at $10, using water that the county assessor said did not exist, on land that a man at a trading post said would not feed a lizard. They laughed when we came here. The man behind the counter and the men on the porch and Colton Mercer and everyone else who looked at 3 half Navajo children with 2 canvas bags and a deed worth less than the cost it took to file it. They are not laughing now. The underground river still flows, clean, cold, steady, indifferent to drought and politics and the passage of time. It will flow when everyone alive today is dust. It will flow when the names of the people who doubted us are forgotten. It will flow because that is what rivers do. They do not stop. They do not forget. They find a way through. And on the wall of the cavern, beside the ancient handprints that guided us here, my children painted 3 new ones. Mine, Lark's, Fenn's. In red ochre, the same pigment the ancestors used 1,000 years ago. Smaller than most of the ancient ones, but no less permanent, no less real. Beneath them in Diné and in English, they wrote 7 words. They opened the wall. The water remembered. And below that in Fenn's careful handwriting, the last thing he ever wrote before the notebooks closed and the pencil was put down and the quiet teacher went to sleep for the last time, 2 more words. So did Father.